Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Soul Focus Radio. This is Martin, and I want to welcome you. This is going to be part two of our discussion around the war with Ukraine. And this time around, Dustin is going to interview me. And what we're going to talk about is how connected fear is to ego and how that's the root of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now and with the rest of the world and the viewpoint of it and how we're viewing it in the United States and all of that. And, just thinking about how we often talk to you about our goal at the Soul Focus Group being moving from ego to power. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about moving out of fear and into a more balanced place of understanding around anything in our lives. But we're going to use this particular world event. So stay tuned. We're so glad you're here, and let's go.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Soul Focus Radio. This is Dustin, and today I get to sit in the host seat and spend some time exploring the brilliant mind of our brother Martin Friedman. Martin, how you doing, bro?
Dustin, I'm doing great. Excited to have this conversation. I'm currently, in Cleveland. I'm seeing my mom, who's 90, and just talking about everything going on in her life and what I can do to support her and being happy and healthy and have an easeful life at this time of her time in this, of her spirit being in this body. And so it's been a powerful day, man. And I'm excited to have this conversation.
Beautiful. And I know as you're leaving Cleveland to come out here to Seattle, so I'm super excited to see you.
Yes, sir. As am I. Really looking forward to seeing you and being back in Seattle for a couple of days.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. And so, for our listeners, this is the second part of our conversation around the conflict, the war in the Ukraine. And, as everyone knows, we are the Soul Focus Group. And that's not just a name that we chose because it sounds cute or mysterious, but our intention at the Soul Focus Group, for us, first and foremost, is making sure that we live lives that are truly soul focused. And that's what we're all striving for, but also to bring soul focused technology, a way of life to the world. And you've heard us talk a lot about ego. And the fact is we live in a world that is constructed by ego focused minds. And so, Martin, I know there may be some listeners that are coming into this podcast, didn't listen to the first one, maybe never listened to any of our podcasts. So I think it's important as we talk about ego, fear, and the conflict and the war in Ukraine, that you just share a brief definition of ego so our listeners, new listeners and old listeners, can get a sharpened up understanding of what we mean when we say the ego. Because there's a lot of conversation out there. We use ego, meaning arrogant and all that, but ego is so
That's
much
right.
more expansive. So could you share just a working definition for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I too was raised with the idea. I actually, Dustin, I was raised from an early age on an understanding of Freudian psychology of the id, the ego, and the superego, right? And so, I learned this early on that like the id is the child, the superego is the parent, and then the ego, would be the self. Essentially, is how it was explained to me. And so, what happened over the course of my life and my understanding is that ego went on to be inflated ego, or like you said, arrogance. Nobody ever talked about ego in a healthy sense or a balanced sense anymore. So ego has took on this idea in popular culture that ego just means, that, overinflated sense of self, right? But really what we're talking about is an out of balanced ego. That's really what we're talking about. And so it's really only been, since I've worked with my D as a coach and you've gone deep in this exploration of ego and really been a teacher and a mentor to me on it, that I've come to understand that ego, as we know it now, really is false self. It's a construction. As I understand it, ego, was based in survival tactics, right? Like we needed to know, we needed fear to stay alive thousands and thousands of years ago because we needed to be afraid of things that might eat us, right?
Right.
And what happened though is that sense of fear becomes inputted programmed with all these external ideas about who we are. So the ego becomes this receptacle for outside messages that then define us. So as I understand it now, it's an outside in perspective of myself.
Hmm.
And we often quote Carl Jung, and Carl Jung says that if you don't have a clear idea of who you are, the world will tell you who you are. And I would say that my understanding, Dustin, is that the world tells all of us who we are. If we have a clear understanding of who we are, we don't believe the world. But the world tells each and every one of us who we are based on gender, on race, on geography, on physical size, on class, on anything that you can think of, because all of that is subjective. The value given to like skin color, hair texture, facial features, the value given to gender, the value given to class, all of the value given is all made up. It's all external. But we've been told that way since we were little tiny kids. We've been told to believe certain things about other people and ultimately about ourselves based on those characteristics. And we've been told either to give value or devalue. So my understanding of the ego now is that ego is a series of ideas and beliefs that were given to us externally, almost at birth, within a year or two of birth, was starting to be given to us. And that now it's many of us, what we believe is us is actually our ego, because the us, the true self, is the soul, the infinite being, the spirit that's just spending a little tiny bit of time in these human forms. And so my understanding of ego is that it's false self, and that it was given to us externally, and that the way it's given to us externally helps keep some people in power and makes the majority of us feel like we don't have power over our own selves, our own choices, and it makes us feel overwhelmed and hopeless, to change our circumstances and to change the world's circumstances.
Beautiful definition. I appreciate that. And that definition, Martin, of the false self is really going to frame this conversation we're having on this session. And, as you check out the discourse that a lot of folks are having around the potential of a nuclear war, given the threats, the alert that Putin has put Russia on, knowing that, both the United States and other NATO nations, as well as Russia, have more than enough weapons to destroy the whole world and all life on the world. There's a lot of fear that we're entering into World War III. And you talked in your definition of ego, you talked about programming. And one of the other concepts that you will hear us talk a lot about at the Soul Focus Group is a concept called groundwater, which is our subconscious programming. All of us have been programmed at a very early age, and now we have a groundwater that drives how we interact with the world, and it works in a symbiotic way with our ego. So, fear has been sowed deep in our groundwater, especially, when you think about the era you and I grew up in, Martin. I know you're going to remember this. There was so much panic and fear around nuclear war when we were children. You probably remember,
Yes.
I mean, the Soviet Union was the evil enemy, right? They called it the evil empire. And I even remember, man, we would have nuclear war drills in elementary school where we would get them to desks, which is insane. Like being under a desk would save us from a nuclear war, right?
Duck and cover.
Yeah. And, you also remember movies like The Day After that showed how nuclear war would be, which was just, a terror campaign. And so there's so much fear in our collective groundwater and our collective ego within this society. And now, again, there's so many folks talking about the potential of, being in World War III and that world war having a potential nuclear component. What would you say to people in relationship to that sense of possibility? How are you managing your fears you may have around that? But more importantly, what would you say to other people who are experiencing fear around the potential of a nuclear war?
Yeah, great question, Dustin. So let me start with me first. What I've been finding myself, I think part of my ego, the way my ego has manifested in terms of, some of my identity. I didn't mention like culture, right? Or ethnicity. That's also external identity that's put on us. So, I walk around with these identities around like a white Jewish man, Ashkenazi Jewish, Jew of European descent, ancestors came out of the pogroms, not a literal child of the European Holocaust, but a figurative one in the era that I was born, being born in 1963 and kind of in that shadow. So I say all that because a huge part of my subconscious programming has always been to have fear of something terrible happening. And to,
Mm.
I would say that generationally, there's a level of multi-generational trauma that's been passed down to me that, like, we have a name for it. It's called kinahora, which basically it means like, the other shoe's going to drop, like the evil eye, like you got to like protect yourself because something horrible is about to happen. So I have to frame the answer to your question for me. Like, this is something I've been working on my whole life, is the power that neurotic fears and thoughts have about things that, if I had $1 for every minute I spent imagining something horrible happening to me or someone I know, Dustin, we'd be like retired and living in the Maldives, man. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I would be a billionaire because I've literally spent 1 billion minutes. If I've lived 1 billion minutes, however many minutes I've lived, man. So I really wanted to give it like a little bit more of a depth of framing, because I'm already in a practice to not be doing. So I have found myself in the last couple of weeks in two fear-based thought patterns. One, like, what's going to happen if everything crashes, the market crashes? What if our life as we know it, is going to change? I mean, this is true for many people in the world, but, it's so public. And I do want to say too, I think there's something about, and other people have talked about this, but there's something about Ukraine being European and seeing European people being bombed,
Yeah.
European people in the present fleeing as refugees. I read an article recently that says we like our refugees blonde haired and blue eyed.
Yeah.
And, you and I both have talked about the fact that Africans, trying to escape the Ukraine have not had the same freedom to enter into like Hungary and Poland and places like that. They've been detained for days,
Right.
And so there's this element of seeing Europeans, being of European descent, and seeing Europeans going through this, being without power, being without fresh water, that has made me start to think about, what would my life be like if I didn't have power, if I didn't have water, if the economy collapses around us like it's collapsing in Russia right now, right?
Right.
Like what would happen if these things? So I have found myself in a place of fear. And you asked me what I do, and what I do is, as quickly as I can, I practice soul focused group technology. I recognize it. I recognize that that's where my thoughts are going. I kind of reprogram or re-engineer those thoughts. I realize that those thoughts aren't real. And then I just keep repeating that until I'm no longer in that thought process anymore. My advice to myself and to everyone, Dustin, is like, what does it mean for our lives when we spend time and energy on something that is not happening to us, that only might happen to us? Because really, we know that ego really lives in the past and the future. So the past, the way the ego shows up for me around fear, is this multi-generational fear that something horrible is going to happen to me, being a Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish person. And then the ego is like, something horrible, nothing horrible is happening to me right now, and it hasn't, around being Jewish, but then something horrible will happen in the future.
Right.
So the ego, for me, for all of us, that fear-based ego, the ego-based fear, lives in the past and the future. So what I would say to everybody is, ground yourself in the present. If you're spending a lot of time worrying about what might happen, what are you losing in the moment by spending time in the moment on something that may or may not ever happen?
I love that answer. And in your answer, Martin, you talked about the multi-generational fear that you grew up with, and this
Yes.
state of neurosis that comes from being in a constant state of fear. And so, as you were talking, one of the things that was running through my mind is how fear is sowed throughout across every sector of our society, especially through mass media and our education system. And so what that tells me, and ought to tell our listeners, is that there is a functionality of fear, and fear is used as a social tool. What is fear used for within our society? Why are there so many proponents of fear from the forces that socialize us?
I guess I'm probably just going to keep saying this, but another great question, another great question. And, what I would say is that the purpose of fear is absolutely to control us. The only reason to want people to be in a state of fear is because when people are in a state of fear, they're easy to control. And we have so many examples of this in history. There's been a lot of things that have been made up to be afraid of. I mean, I just think about this world that we live in right now, like this society, this reality in America. We may not have a war going on, but we have so much fear mongering going on every side of like the political and the ideological aisle right now. Like everybody is telling people to be scared of whatever you think. Be scared we're losing democracy. Be scared that we're entering into dictatorship. Like
Be
I hear
scared of
liberals
crime,
and
right?
yeah, be scared of crime. Be scared that our democracy as we know it is going to end. Both sides are saying that right now. You know what I mean? Like politically and ideologically. You know, be afraid of anything you say in public that might get you canceled. Like I mean, we could go on, right? But the only purpose of fear, as we're talking about it, because this is all ego based fear. This is virtual fear. This is not real fear. We're not afraid of being eaten anymore. This is virtual fear.
Right.
You know, the example I use that I love because it always resonates with people, Dustin, is like one of the first ways we feel fear as kids and as we start to get older is we're scared of embarrassment,
Mm.
right? We have so much fear of being embarrassed, of looking silly or looking stupid, of being shamed publicly. And, I love the example of like people saying, I was so embarrassed, I thought I would die. Like, honestly, who's ever died from embarrassment? Nobody's ever died from
Yeah.
embarrassment.
Yeah.
Though I love the word mortified, Dustin, because mort means death. It's the French word
Hmm.
for death. So
Hmm.
when people say I'm mortified, you're really saying I'm about to die. So you're about to die because of what? Because you're wearing the same clothes as somebody else, or because somebody said something, or you made a mistake, or you called someone the wrong name or used the wrong word or whatever. Like the fact that shame makes us feel like literally like all we want to do is die, like that's a deep manipulation that happens to us. I would say starts somewhere between like 5 and 10 years old. You don't see like, I mean, you're experiencing two very strong-willed characters. I'm gonna be transparent too. We've heard one of those characters in the background, and it's all right. It's all right, man. We're human beings, right? And so you have two very strong-willed characters under 5 years old. They're not walking around talking about how embarrassed they are or how
No.
ashamed they are. Have you ever heard them use that terminology?
No. No. Never.
No, they're fully in their genius. They're creating. Doesn't mean they're not struggling with things or whatever, different things are going on, but they don't understand that concept yet of being ashamed of something, of being so embarrassed you would want to die. So that's gonna be programmed. That programming is gonna hit them. And I know you and Megan are gonna do everything you can to not have it be, impact them in a negative way. But that programming in school, that programming in media, that starts to really hit kids around 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And
Yeah.
then by the time we're teenagers, we're fully in that fear.
Right.
So all we're doing is we're just being primed to be scared ass adults,
Yeah.
to walk around scared of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, wearing the wrong thing, you know, jumping in the water and having our bathing suit fall off, like that should make us want to die. Like if you really think about it, we've been programmed from a very young age to be in a constant state of fear, constant fear of making mistakes. And so that just has primed us to have it, to literally be capitalized on by our fears. You know, we have a fear-based economy. Scarcity is fear.
Yeah.
To think we don't have enough. We have so much, but we've been trained that we don't have enough, that you could lose what you have in any given moment.
Yeah.
I see it through the Ashkenazi Jewish lens, but I know you see it, you've been taught that through the lens of being black. Everybody has a story about being taught that.
No, absolutely. I mean, fear was essentially the juice that I drank growing up, and the
Mm,
same multi-generational fear you talked about in the European Jewish community. The fear that stemmed from slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, is the same fear that permeates the Black community. And it, as you're talking and thinking about groundwater, thinking about war, one of the things that
Yeah.
strikes me is, you and I, and many of us who are listening right now, have been consumers of decades of violence through movies, television, and just thinking, while
Yes.
there's a progressive thread and maybe an overall thread with the United States that's in opposition to this specific war, and only because they've been taught to be in opposition to Russia. Because there's other wars, like when
Right.
we invade somewhere, or when we attack somewhere, and we justify that, then we're all for that
That's
war.
right.
But thinking
That's
about
right.
how, you know, we watch murder and mayhem on television, and we've been numbed out to that level of violence and how that's been sowed into our groundwater. And so thinking about, I was talking about the war with Mahdi, and one of the things he said that really struck me is like, bro, we are so uncivilized that we're still engaging in 2022 in warfare. You think about how advanced we've
Yeah.
become in terms of technology, but we're still essentially
Yeah.
living as cavemen. And so on the last podcast, you spoke about, the mind that uses technology to create weapons like thermobaric weapons that ignite, that send fuel out into the air, missile fuel, then ignite those to essentially incinerate people, suck the air out of people. And of
Yeah.
course, we create bunker buster bombs and nuclear weapons, and we celebrate this. And so I want to ask you, when you
Yeah.
think about, as we talk about the psychology of people engaged in war and what we all have to outgrow, because this psychology is in all of us, not just our leaders. And see, there's a tendency for us to want to just point at the leaders, but it's important for us to say that this psychology has been embedded in all of us. I want to ask you, what does that say about the minds of people that we use technology to create weapons like nuclear weapons, like thermobaric weapons? And I must say, before you answer that question, Martin, there's so much fear about Russia launching a nuclear war. But the truth is, only the United States of America has ever used that weaponry on human beings. Talking
Right.
about
Right.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So, in
Yeah.
fact, given historical proof, folks should be as scared of the United States. But that's a digression. But again, Martin, I really want you to focus in on the mindset of people to use technology not to solve the vast amount of social problems that we're being perplexed with for generations, but to kill.
Whew. All right. So yeah, there's so much there. Really, really,
Another
Dustin.
great one.
That's
Another
such
great
a.
one.
It's yeah. I was going to say deep this time. I was going to say a very deep and nuanced question is what I was going to say.
Yeah.
This actually coincides. I haven't had this conversation with you. I've been meaning to have it with both you and my D. But I read one of the things that I read. You may have even sent it to me, or it sent me something that got me down this rabbit hole. But it was a Marine, a U.S. Marine, and who had fought in like Iraq and Kuwait and maybe Afghanistan in urban warfare, and
Mhm.
basically a message to the Ukrainian soldiers on like how you could kill the most people, right? How if you're outmanned, like so. I mean, you're talking about the not hyperbaric. That's not what it's called, but
Thermobaric.
what's it called again? Thermobaric,
Thermobaric.
right? Thermobaric weapons. But I'm just talking about like people that are trained that their job is to be as good at killing other people as possible. So
Yeah.
this person was giving advice like how to funnel people to stairwells and all these different things and talking about kill shots. And it just for some reason, and it may be, Dustin, that I don't really watch violent stuff anymore. Like I was, as you know, that was my thing, right?
Yeah.
From The Sopranos to The Wire to
All kinds of stuff,
um,
right?
yeah, man, I can't think of the Showtime one that I
Game of
love so
Thrones.
much.
Oh,
Yeah, Game of
uh,
Thrones, but Lev Schreiber with the Irish family. Anyways, it's just all of it's so violent. So many people die, and I really don't watch that much anymore. The Godfather of Harlem was another one I watched more recently. And I think maybe so. The idea that we have the job of not just here in the United States, but all over the world, that there's a job that you can get where the primary thing that you do is you learn to kill people as effectively as possible.
mhm.
And so where I've been going, it's amazing you're asking me this question because I've been like trying to trace what is that about. somewhere along the line, one of the things that's happened in our ego is that individually and then collectively, we've come to believe that we have to kill other people to survive,
Mm.
right? That we can't survive unless other people die. And now I understand that there's been war for a really long time, and there's been, people have taken things from, cavemen took things from other cavemen, right? And there's been, empire for thousands and thousands of years and domination over. But I would still say that was a relatively small population of the world. I would still say, because if you look at the essence of a child, the essence of a child at the very earliest ages is not to dominate other children, or to dominate another person. It's not a violent essence that we come into this world with. So if we're not coming into the world with a violent essence, then I'm feeling like at some point along the line, we have to learn it. And so where we are right now is where, that scarcity idea, which is ego based and it very much exists in white culture, that scarcity idea is so intense now that a lot of us, either individually or collectively, are walking around thinking that we have to kill to stay alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're also creating environments where that's true.
Right.
Where that's true, that where people do have to kill to stay alive. But there's a whole, just think about and that's everywhere. That's the poor neighborhoods in this country. There's a lot of kids, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds that are carrying guns that feel like they have to kill to survive.
Yeah.
That's not, I'm not saying it's not real, because I understand it's real in their lives. It's a construct.
Yeah.
Because you 5 miles away, the 10 and 12-year-olds have no concept of living life like that. The 10 and 12-year-olds are not carrying guns and they're not thinking about it.
Sometimes right next door in a gentrified city like Seattle, literally next door, those kids don't have that concept.
Good point.
Well, Martin, as you bring that up, what is going on in the minds of Americans, especially white Americans, where there is so much animosity around Russia invading the U.S. and the death that's happening there? And this is, again, not an either or question, because we should be upset about that. We should be upset about that happening anywhere. So how is it that there can be so much uproar around this occurring, but no uproar around the murders that are occurring every single day in Chicago, Seattle, Philadelphia, of predominantly young Black people? And, you think about, we talk about the traumatic impact of war. And, there's a study that we have talked about quite a bit, that children in Chicago, specifically the south side of Chicago and sometimes the west side, have higher trauma rates than children in war-torn Iraq. And so why will there be so much energy in the collective imagination around what's happening to the Ukrainians, but no energy around what's happening in South Central LA, in North Philadelphia, in the Bronx, in Chicago, downtown Seattle, South Seattle? What is that about?
So I'm going to use a fancy phrase and then I'm going to say it more plainly. But we've all been acculturated into linear either or thinking, us against them thinking. That's the simple way of saying it. It's teams. When me and Madi were interviewed by Felicia, she talked to us about football. And she's like, as you all are such gentle spirits, you're kind, sensitive people. Why do you all love football so much, right? We love our teams. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. It's amazing that you're asking me these questions, because I don't know if I talked to you about it or not. But, I've been really thinking a lot about Israel and Palestine. And Felicia and I are getting ready to go there this summer. And, I was there again. I was there 6 years ago. And, I remember growing up and, being raised in a home that was pretty Zionist. I mean, not hardcore, but it was just like default Zionist, which we almost all of us in the 70s and 80s coming up, 60s and 70s really for me. And I remember watching the wars like they were football games, right? Like the Yom Kippur War, the wars only lasted a few days. And it was like, oh, we won. Because we, being the Israelis, that was the team that I rooted for. So I really remember, when I go back in my mind, that's how I remember it. And so right now, I even find myself, I have a pretty deep understanding of how this all works. And I still find myself, looking at what Russia's doing and feeling certain ways that I might not feel when I think about what we did in Iraq or whatever. Right.
Right.
This idea of, like you talked about last time, regime changes, there's a list of like 30 regime changes that the United States have been involved with, in the last 50 to 70 years,
Yeah.
right? And we don't see it in the same way. And we don't see it in the same way, just like, and I'm gonna use a football analogy. We definitely spot the pass interference on the other team, but when it's our team, they're just playing tough. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're just covering
Right.
the guy. They're covering the guy
Right.
tight, right?
Right.
But when it's the other team, look, his hands are all over him. Ref, throw the flag. Like,
Right.
we are programmed from such a young age to see differently, whether it's us or whether it's them. And we could go from macro and war down to micro, and just think about how we divide out, and whatever way we're dividing out from the time we're little kids, what we're doing is good and what the other people are doing is bad. That's learned. That's an either or way of looking at the world. It's because a line is drawn down the middle. And so you're either with us or you're against us. You're either good or you're bad. And so that is so deeply programmed in every one of our egos. I remember, Dustin, when you and I were posting, and some other people, we were posting early on in the pandemic, we were posting commentaries to video, right? Remember we were doing that like 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And there was one that was about love. I think it might have been the 4 Agreements. And I talked about needing to love everybody. And, I have I would say that most of the people in my circle are fairly liberal, would describe themselves as liberal, Democrats, et cetera. And I talked about needing to love everybody, including Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And kind, loving, gentle people were like, I could never, I will never love him. He's the devil. I'm like, what? Come on now. Like, I'm being serious. Like, I'm in a practice where I can love him. I can love the human being in him. I can disagree with things that he does. I disagree with a whole lot that the liberal left does.
Right.
And I can still love them too.
Right.
As soon as you say that you can't love another human being, regardless of what they've done, you are starting to lose some of your own humanity, because you're opening it up to say that you also can do things to make you not be loved.
Yeah.
And I think it's an assault on our the very basic soul beings that we are, to not be able to find love in everyone. I'm talking about, like, I have to be able to find love for Hitler. You know what I mean? And that's ingrained in me. There's probably Jewish people that are listening right now that are shutting their podcast down and saying, he's not a real Jew. He's not a this or that. How could you ever say that? But, like, I don't care. Genghis Khan, Hitler, I don't care. Whoever it is that you hate, like, what the reason why this exists is because we don't see that we could also be that person in certain circumstances.
That's right.
And until we realize that we could be anybody, you or I, given the circumstances, we could be Putin right now.
Absolutely.
Given certain circumstances, we could do that, because as you say often, like, we are one, like, all of us. So the reason why this is happening is because we've allowed ourselves to believe we're not one anymore. And we've allowed ourselves to be programmed into us versus them from the earliest age, from the earliest micro divisions to these giant macro divisions that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the truth is, if any of us were socialized the way Donald Trump was, the way Vladimir Putin was, we would probably, unless we committed to doing serious transformational work on ourselves, we will show up like most of us do as a product of our conditioning, our groundwater, and how our egoic minds show up today. And, and as you lay out Hitler and Genghis Khan and Vladimir Putin, those are folks that we have decided to see as evil. But imagine this, Martin. Right. What do you think the people, Barack Obama had a drone list and he would sign off on decisions of who would be allowed to be attacked by drones. And those drones didn't just kill combatants. They would often kill families, children, women, elderly. Those same folks would hate Barack Obama in the same way the Jewish community currently hates Hitler, right? Now, Barack Obama,
and in the same way that
what were you going to say?
I was going to say in the same way that the Palestinian community hates the Jewish-Israeli community right now.
Exactly. And it becomes a vicious cycle, right? No one's coming to save us. That's one of the things my D taught me very early on. Nobody's coming to save us. I don't care what religion has taught us. It's going to be upon us to break this cycle that's keeping us. Because the fact is, folks are talking about World War III, but we're in a war amongst ourselves. I mean, we have war on our streets. We have ongoing conflict, like the Ukrainian ones. The Ukrainian conflict is predominant in the media right now, but there's conflict going on all across the globe. And this is not going to
Yeah.
change until we change. And we keep looking for someone else to make the change, whether that's a social movement or certain leaders. But the fact is, we have to make the change and look at how we're contributing to this whole
Yeah.
cycle of egoic madness. And so on that note, Martin, I know we're coming to the end of the podcast. And I really I want to thank you for your wisdom and your beautiful insight into these questions. But I want to leave our listeners, especially our listeners who are parents or who have access to children. And I would love to ask you, Martin, what is something that those of us who are parents or caregivers, teachers, educators, coaches, anyone who has access to children, what can we begin to do to prepare our children to create and construct through their genius, to construct a world that is very different than this? Because you talked about hearing Elijah and Nico in the background, and I'm glad that's happening, because their voices are full of love and joy. But
Yes.
I think about the
Yes.
world they're going to inherit. How do we prepare our children to become different leaders in constructing a newer world, a newer way of thinking, a newer way of being?
Yeah, this is good. This is another good one. Another good one. Before I answer it, I do want to just say I want to. We talked in more extreme examples, and this is going to tie into my answer. But also, I was in social services for 20 plus years, as you know,
Right,
right?
right.
And the people that are tasked with social services right now are doing the same thing with the people that they serve, not seeing them as fully human.
How so?
And that's happening. Well, how so? In the sense of like to me, the people that run programs don't see themselves unless they were there at one point. And even if they were there at one point, they're not seeing themselves in the people, of the programs they're running. I used to run part of a social service program. And I think one of the things that made me good at what I did was because, a lot of the people that were there because of addiction, drug and alcohol addictions, gambling addictions. And I always felt like, even though I was there as the director, I could have been there as a resident.
Mhm.
But I think most social services are based off of the idea that it's charitable and we could never be where you are for the most part. Like
Mhm.
most of the people that give money and run these nonprofits, it's the same dynamic. They're not seeing themselves in the people that they serve, right? There's a sense of superiority in that could never be me, you
Right,
know? And
right.
and I can tell you for a fact, because I was in that world for a long time, it could be any one of us: drugs, alcohol, an accident, a loss of income. I mean, I'm telling you, any one of us could experience homelessness or be incarcerated, right? So, having said that, what would I tell kids? What would I tell your beautiful children who are my godchildren?
And what would you tell the
Who
parents?
I love. Yeah, what I would tell the parents to tell those kids, and what I would tell them when I talk to them. Two things that I'm thinking of right now. One is we get to choose how we feel at any given moment about anything, right? So the world is going to tell us that we have to react in certain ways to certain things. And what I would tell the parents to tell the kids, and what I'll tell the kids myself, would be that you don't have to always respond the same way in the same situation, that you always have a choice. And that will always be where your power will be, is knowing that you have a choice on essentially like what you create in your life. Because every time you make a choice, you create a new reality, right? Just think about what we've been talking about. Putin has made certain choices. The United States has made certain choices. NATO has made certain choices. Ukraine has made certain choices that has gotten us to where we are right now.
Right,
And at
right.
any moment, any one of those entities could have made a different choice and we would not be exactly where we are. So
Truly.
the one thing I would tell parents and I would tell these kids is to start to realize at as young age as possible that you can actually shape your own reality by the choices that you make. I was coaching somebody yesterday, and just they're coming to understand that, and it's like life altering for them, that they don't have to be mad in the certain situations anymore, that you can take the exact same situation and not be mad anymore. And the other thing that I would say is every time you look at a person, say to yourself, that could be me. I could be that person. And really, really, Dustin, if you wanna really go all the way there, is I am that person, and that person is me.
That's
That
right.
person could be me, and I could be them. And really, ultimately, we are one shared energy. We are different manifestations of the same energy. So the main thing that I would tell kids is always see yourself. Anything you do to someone else, imagine it happening to you.
Mm.
Would you want that thing to happen to you that you just did to that person? Would
Wow.
you want it to happen to your? If I was talking to Nico, I would say, Nico, would that thing that you just did, would you want it to happen to Elijah, to your baby brother?
Right.
Would you want it to happen to mommy or daddy? That thing that you're okay with happening to someone else, are you okay with it happening to you, to people that you love, your family, the ones that love you and care for you and take have nothing but love for you, and you have nothing but love for them? We can't ever be okay with anything happening to someone else that we wouldn't be okay with happening to us or the people that we love. That's the main thing I would say to them.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Wow, Martin, it was powerful to be in this chair and to ask you these questions. And I just wanted to say
Yeah.
thank you so much for your brilliance, for your wisdom, for the love you have in your heart, how you're living your life. And I hope our listeners really receive the power in the message that Martin shared with us on this episode. To our listeners, we want to say thank you for listening. We hope that you get a chance to go to our YouTube page and subscribe. Go to our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe. Keep coming back to the podcast. We're on Spotify. We're on iTunes. And we just want to say that we love you deeply. Uh, we care about each of you. And in this ego-focused world, the antidote for all of us is to stay soul